title of the talk. So basically looking at how the design of Metro, how the architecture was inspired back in the 60s. I will focus some on Montgomery County specifically, because we're here in Montgomery County. And then I'll spend a few minutes at the end talking about Metro today, some of the challenges we faced, from shutdowns to SafeTrack, to everything that our new general manager is trying to focus on, and then also some of the funding challenges that we have faced really for 40 years, and how I see that playing out in the next couple of years. So, going back to 1960, was when the National Capital Transit Agency was established. So this was primarily a federal agency that reported to Congress. And by 1965, the agency had proposed a 25-mile, 25-station system that was primarily focused just within DC. Now back at that time, they'd also envisioned extensions having come all the way out to Germantown, out to Dulles and on to Leesburg and other areas. But that was a proposal back in 1965. And they started working on hiring engineers, hiring architects. Now back in this day, back then, major public works projects such as transit systems, the model was that you would hire an engineering firm, and that firm would subcontract work to an architectural firm to kind of make everything look pretty at the end. One of the major differences with how Metro was designed from the outset was that they awarded 2 contracts, one to an engineering firm, one to an architectural firm, and those firms were considered equals in the design of Metro. So it really put the architecture at a much higher level when it came to designing Metro. Back in 1966, President Johnson wrote to the NCTA, encouraging the NCTA to search worldwide for concepts and ideas that could be used to make this system attractive as well as useful. It should be designed so as to set an example for the nation and to take its place among the most attractive in the world. In selecting architects for this system, you must seek those who can best combine utility with good urban design. So that was in February. The next month, NCTA awarded the contract to Harry Weiss and Harry Weiss and Associates. His firm had a lot of experience. It was more of a Midwest firm. One thing that differentiated them is that they had built a lot of prototypes, and that was something that they saw was beneficial here in DC to help build some prototypes. They actually built a prototype of a section of a station. They built a prototype of what a rail car would look like. That rail car prototype ended up on the White House lawn, and that was kind of part of how they helped sell the whole region on this concept of a brand new transit system. And then right after they were hired, Harry Weiss and his associates actually embarked on a 42-day, 18-city trip to Europe where they explored and studied human transportation and the interaction between people and the cities in Europe to see what works, what doesn't work, and what would they want to bring back as they help design this system. So I was able to find a couple sketches that they, from their notepads, sketch pads back from 1966. So this was their sketch of London back in the day. And this is the sketch of in Paris. And note here that Paris was called Metro, and Metro. A couple years later, after they came back, no one knew exactly what to call DC's metro system, and the concept that an international world-class system, the term metro had sort of caught on around the world. So other systems that were kind of contemporary in San Francisco, they had BART, Bay Area Rapid Transit, and other names for systems. But we were sort of the first one here to just have the simple name of Metro, and of course Paris was one of the inspirations for that. Here's another sketch, Stockholm, and I chose to put this one in because if you look closely, sort of at the end of the platform there, you'll see bare rock. So kind of different, and I did a quick Google search, and Stockholm still has some of this bare rock exposed in their system. Other pictures, you can see that they've kind of prettied it up with some artistic paint and things like that. But anyway, one of Harry Weiss's concepts for Metro was to actually have bare rock exposed in the system. It's one of the concepts that he took to the Commission on Fine Arts, and they summarily vetoed that concept. So I think to the benefit of our of our system. But anyway, that was one of his inspirations that came back and didn't make it into the final plans for Metro. Soon after that summer of 1966, they started sketching out what would the system look like, and where would some of the focal points be within the system. And you'll see that some of these focal points are still some of our focal points. L'Enfant Plaza as a major transfer station. Gallery Place, the Portrait Gallery as a transfer station. Metro Center as a transfer station. So some of these concepts from 1966 definitely influenced the final design of what we had. And they actually had a more refined map also. So it kind of gets you to closer to what the system looked like. And then you see that they also had the station manager kiosk, and then the concept rendering shows their initial map on the front of that kiosk. Also that summer, they did a first sketch of what the station, of how it would look. So Harry Weiss had a couple different concepts for how the station tunnels and platforms would look. His concept for the subway part of the system, we're about half aerial, half, the system is about half subway, and then the other half is either at grade or aerial. So his concept for the subway portion of the system was to have this vaulted look to the system. Actually, his concept for other parts of the system, where we were what's called cut and cover, so where we're basically just below the surface. Basically there we have to build a box, and then you just cover back up with dirt. His concept there was that you should maximize the amount of space for the customers. So he wanted to have a flat roof on those parts of the system. Eventually, the concept of the coffered vault won out, and that was the system, the concept that is used throughout the system, whether it's really far below grade or even right at, near the surface. So then after a couple years, this very sketch rendering became this sketch rendering, and this of course is the system that we know today, and really this is what it looks like. It's amazing how this sketch influenced and became the ultimate design. Obviously this is one of our transfer stations downtown. Another thing I noticed was that Harry Weiss felt that as you emerge out of the system, you need to be, have a grand experience as you emerge out of the system. And my commute is basically a Shady Grove to Judiciary Square commute. So most mornings I emerge out of Judiciary Square looking at the Building Museum. So when I saw the picture of Paris, I was like, wow, that looks a lot like our Judiciary Square station and how it appears as you emerge out of that station. He also had a concept that that the areas where the entrances to Metro should be active areas. Oops. So one of his ideas also was to have a station at Farragut. And the concept was to have Farragut as a transfer station, and that people would be in the park, coming out of the Metro system, engaged and active in the Farragut Square, in the park down there. One of the challenges that Harry Weiss felt back then, one of the challenges that we continue to face at Metro, is actually working with the National Park Service. And they determined that no, you should not be emerging out of the park. The park needs to be preserved exactly as it is. Apparently back in that day, there was also plans for building underground parking underneath Farragut Park, and that was vetoed. And the park also felt that any entrance to the Metro system coming out in the middle of the park was also anathema to what they envisioned for Farragut Square. So ultimately, one of the drawbacks is that we have two stations very close together, Farragut North, Farragut West, but the only way to access those two stations is to come out of the ground and walk down a block and go back into the system. But if anyone wants to know why, it's not because we didn't envision it, even back in the 60s. It was just that the concept was vetoed by others that influence what we can do. Quickly, we still face issues with also the Park Service vetoed or influenced where the station for the Smithsonian is, urging it to be over on the side of the mall, sort of obscured, not as visible, not marring the look on the National Mall. And we continue to face some issues with the Park Service. all of our escalators have to be covered eventually. Any new escalator that we install must be covered. So one of the challenges we continue to face to this day is how to work with the Park Service and have them approve the canopies that we put over our escalators. And often they will not approve any of the concepts that Metro comes up with. Another concept that never made it into being was going over Rock Creek. So this was this would have allowed us to be not nearly as deep at DuPont and Woodley Park. But instead of building sort of along with the Taft Bridge there, we ended up having to go beneath Rock Creek. So another one of the challenges, and one of the challenges of working with Park Service. Definitely one of the things that Harry Weiss emphasized in his design of the system, and as he looked at other systems, some stations, in other, some other systems, every station is unique, has its unique art, unique architecture. His concept, Commission for Fine Arts concept for Washington, D.C. was to have a uniform look to the system. And furthermore, he decided that he was inspired by the grandeur of the nation's capital. So granite, bronze, from sculptures, from statues, and also at the time, sort of the concrete that was, with brutalism and brutalist architecture. Those were the basic influences for the stations. And to a large extent, that continues today. So we still have the granite stairs, granite edges on the platforms. To some extent, we're going with stainless steel in some places, but still there's definitely bronze, throughout the system. And then, of course, you see the hexagonal tiles. That was also inspired back then and continues even when we replace station platforms today with square tiles. We have those square tiles imprinted with the hexagonal design to try to stay true to the initial design of the system. So moving on beyond the 1966, I know I have limited time, so I'll get to 1967. That's when the WMATA Compact was officially entered into. So the Compact is what we are living with today. So the Compact agency has been around for just over 50 years now. So it's authorized to construct, maintain, operate the transit system. We are subsidized, as Gary mentioned, by the jurisdictions. For Montgomery, Prince George's County, that subsidy comes from the state of Maryland. Today we have 16 board members. We have 8 voting and 8 alternate board members. The 4 federal board members, those are relatively new to the system. They were added in 2009. Back 50 years ago is when this, WMATA adopted the initial concept for the system. The initial concept was 97 miles. That grew over a few years to be 103 miles. Interestingly, here from Montgomery County, something I didn't know until I was doing this research, but Shady Grove was not in the initial 97-mile system. City of Rockville said, no, you can't put a rail yard in our city. So they had to keep going out until they could find space for a rail yard. And that's why we are fortunate to have Shady Grove as part of the system today. Ultimately, we will be adding another 15 miles. I'm sorry, we have added 15 miles to the 103-mile system. So now we're at 118. And the last 11 miles of the system are under construction today. That will take us to Dulles and beyond, a couple stations into Loudoun County. And that right now is the last extension that we have as envisioned for the system. So we are the 2nd largest heavy rail system, 6th largest bus system. We do transport over 400,000 people a day on Metro bus, and the 5th largest paratransit system, which is the system for those with disabilities who cannot use the regular fixed route service. In this. Briefly, as I just mentioned, phase 2 is going to bring the system to 129 miles. This is the sequence of when we added different segments of the system. I don't know if you can see that, but so the Shady Grove was 1984, I believe, and to Glenmont was 1998. So the newest station here in Montgomery County is actually just under 20 years old, which it really isn't that old. And again, we're going to hopefully finish getting to the Silver Line in a couple years. So now I'm going to turn to some of the renderings that I was able to find for Montgomery County stations. And a lot of these you'll see are basically true to what we ended up building. So these are some of the initial concepts. This is the Grosvenor platform, which looks a lot like it is today. Nicholson Lane Station. Who knows what Nicholson Lane is? White Flint. White Flint. So that's the look of the White Flint station. In fact, you can still see the that condo is in the background there, kind of giving it away. Another look at the White Flint station, we'll call it. This is the Shady Grove station. Again, obviously it looks very green out there. Things are changing, but that is basically what the station looked like initially before we added other parking and things like that. And on this station, actually, I don't know why it was shown this way, but Wheaton ended up being a lot different when we actually built it. But this was the initial look for how you would enter the Wheaton station. Obviously, they knew they needed escalators, but it definitely is different than this rendering. I was also able to find some construction photos. So this is Rockville. Shooting over to the other side, this is Forest Glen. And I'll show you, the next one shows you kind of the depth of Forest Glen. Forest Glen is our deepest station, 196 feet deep. It is our only station that is only served by by elevators, sorry. So we have high-speed elevators that take you from street down to the platform in about 20 seconds. And again, it's the only one that's like that. Of course, we do have stairs in case of emergency. You can still get out, but it's unique to Metro in that regard. So here, going up the red line on that side, this is heading up towards Wheaton. And actually, you can see here, this is the tunnel, and it looks like that tunnel is about the width of a single train instead of the width of two trains, which is most of our tunnels are the width of two trains. So this section of Montgomery County, the geology of this area, apparently the soil, everything that we're living in there, the type of rock that's there is not very stable. And the concern was that you can only build a tunnel so big within that type of geologic area. So that's why in that section of our red line, it's called a double bore, where we basically had two individual tunnels just because of the geologic conditions. Apparently, if we wanted to do a single bore tunnel, we would have had to go even deeper, which obviously would have been even more challenging. So that's another look. I believe this is actually getting into the station area, the platform area at Wheaton. And then the escalators under construction at Wheaton. So Wheaton is the deepest, longest escalator in the Western Hemisphere, 230 feet. So I checked it. We're actually number 7 in the world. So if you go over to Moscow, you can actually go ride the longest escalator. And they got us beat by a lot, over 400 feet at one of their stations. Our newest station in Montgomery County, here's some construction photos of Glenmont. And right here you can see this is cut and cover, where basically it's right below the surface, and you can tell how close we were to Georgia as we were building this station. Again, another quick look at the Glenmont station there. And then after this, I'm going to skip forward 20 years or so to where we are today and what Metro means for the region. So obviously we're a driver of economic growth. We estimate that being close to Metro, the property values around Metro are 7 to 9% higher just because of the proximity to Metro. We support over 1 million trips a day on Metrorail and Metro bus combined. And we're obviously a major, of major importance to the federal government. Federal government riders are over a third of our peak commuters on Metrorail. Obviously, environmentally, it's a much more sustainable way of moving people throughout the region. And it also makes the whole region just more affordable. Many people, especially as you get more into the downtown area, you can live a car-free lifestyle, or at least not drive as much because of the proximity of Metro to the region. looking at how we, influence Montgomery County. Basically, the county has focused. People would say that Montgomery County, Arlington County are kind of models for how you focus development around transit. And you can see right here, Bethesda back in 1974 was already somewhat built up before Metro, got there. But by 1998, it was considerably more developed. And then in the early 2000s, it continues to develop. And obviously today with Marriott headquarters and other major developments going on, and at the Purple Line, rebuilding that whole area of Bethesda, it continues to get built up. I was able to find a couple other aerial photos from way back when. So that's, the Strathmore Mansion with not much else around it. Obviously, that area has continued to grow, and actually, that whole parking lot is now a parking garage. We're going to finish expanding that parking garage, and Metro's going to have more development even on Metro's property there at Grosvenor. This is Wheaton. Obviously, Wheaton continues to transform. Park and Planning is building its headquarters there, and other developments have continued around the Wheaton area. And then White Flint. White Flint 1974 does not look anything like White Flint today, obviously. So it continued. I don't know exactly when that top photo there is, but you can see that there's the driving range at White Flint. That was there from about 1995 to about 2004. So that gives you some sense of when that photo was taken. And obviously White Flint continues to develop, and who knows, we might even have a major headquarters there in the future. But seriously, no idea what Amazon is going to do. Maybe a 1 in 20 chance that they would end up at White Flint. But I think significantly for the region and what Metro means to the region, the fact that 3 out of the 20 sites that Amazon is still considering is a great recognition of what Metro means to this region. Amazon said, we want transit accessibility right at our second headquarters, and none of these places would be in the running were not for Metro. So as Gary alluded to, the last couple years have been challenging. I've had to call Gary and say, hey, we're going to shut the system down tomorrow. And literally, and that's, some of the things that we face, deterioration of the system. I mentioned that the WMATA Compact allowed us to build, operate, maintain, but the WMATA Compact does not give taxing authority to Metro. So our support comes from the jurisdictions, and every year we go to the jurisdictions with a request for funding. So that has led to some of the deterioration of the system. As Gary mentioned, the SafeTrack campaign was a heavy, intensive initiative, really focused on the above-ground stations, above-ground rail, for the basic foundation of the system, replacing the wood rail ties that hold the rail. It sounds very basic, it's not very exciting, and it's very complex to do it because you basically have to have that section of rail out of service. There's no other way, and normally the adjacent rail also out of service to do it in any effective, efficient way. Doing that type of intensive work in the couple hours overnight that we have when the system's not running is, the amount of time it takes to stage, replace a few rail ties, and break out and get ready for the next morning's rush hour is just almost makes it not even worth it. And that's why we did the campaign of going in there, shutting a whole section down, and doing it and getting much more productivity during that time. For those who have ridden our new 7000 series rail cars, these rail cars are basically they've replaced the rail cars that we opened with in 1976. So we have replaced all those rail cars. And actually another series of rail cars that was due to be rehabilitated. Instead, we decided just to replace those instead. And we're finishing up replacement of another series of rail cars, what we call the 5000 series. So these rail cars are much more reliable. They have a lot more customer information, and the reviews have been very positive from our customers. We also implemented a couple things. It used to be that if you tapped into the system and then you find out that your train is delayed, we would charge you when you tap out if you decide just to leave. So we're able to stop doing that. So if you tap in, you decide that, oh no, I'm gonna there's a delay, I'm gonna leave the system. Now you have 15 minutes where you can just exit the station. And then if you saw the news on Thursday, our board approved another customer convenience where if your trip during rush hour is delayed more than 15 minutes, we will automatically refund that trip to you. And this is really first in the country and really kind of first in the world. London has a good system where you can apply for a refund, but we're the first one to really just automatically do it. And we can do that because we know we're a tap in, tap out Metrorail system. So we know when you've tapped in, how far you've gone, and when you've tapped out, and we know how long it should take that train to get there. And if it's more than 15 minutes beyond, or the scheduled headway between trains and how long it should take you, then you're gonna get an automatic refund on your Smart Trip card. Other things our general manager has focused on has been fiscal management, trying to get at, reducing any redundancies in the management and the number of employees that we have. We did end up having to eliminate 800 positions. We've on the other side, for the folks on the operations side, we're trying to reduce absenteeism, focus on workers' comp, and then also looking at delivering the capital program. We had years where we would have a budget and we wouldn't even spend all the money that we had just because we've been ramping up the program over time, and it's been challenging just to get all the work delivered. We talked about SafeTrack. I'll skip that slide, I think. And then the general manager has kind of a plan for how to get Metro back on track. It's focused both on capital and on the operating side of the business. So on the capital side, we've identified $25 billion in needs. Over 10 years, we believe we can deliver $15.5 billion of improvements to the system, improvements / really just maintenance of the system. We want to establish a multi-year stable source of funding. Again, we've never had dedicated funding for Metro, so we're seeking $500 million from the region for dedicated funding. We want to keep the rest of the capital program growing at 3%, just keep up with inflation. And then we get funding from Congress that expires in about a year, so we want to see that renewed for another 10 years. On the operating side, there too, we want to continue steady growth of the support that we get from the region, but keep it manageable also for the local governments. So keep that at 3% growth to keep up with inflation. We want a rainy day fund just to respond to emergencies, or if we have a snow apocalypse or whatever, that we can not have our whole budget whacked by events like that. We want to focus, this is controversial for the labor side of the business, but we want to have our new hires who are part of the labor union, have them with a defined contribution system instead of a defined benefit system. So basically getting away from the pension model. Again, controversial if you're on that side of the business, but we think it's something that's more manageable long-term for Metro. And then we're seeing how we can also contract out different functions within Metro. As I mentioned, the funding challenges. This is not anything new for Metro. That center report was done back in 1986. So, we'd been running trains for 10 years at the time. And already back then, folks had realized that the model was not sustainable. These others, the GAO, Brookings Institution back in the mid-2000s issued their own reports about how Metro needed dedicated funding. This is our union has issued a report last year about finding ways to fix and fund Metro. So there's been a groundswell, I would say, in the last couple of years, but it's not a problem that is brand new to Metro. Good news, Gary says I'm a bearer of bad news, but there's good news. Here in Maryland and also in Richmond and in DC, there is legislation right now that would fund Metro, that would establish this $500 million fund that would be dedicated to capital improvements for Metro. So in Maryland, we have two sponsors, actually Montgomery County legislators, Mark Corman in the House and Brian Feldman in the Senate. So if I can ask anything of you guys is to go back and urge your legislators to support these bills. I think most Montgomery County legislators have actually signed on to these bills. But House Bill 372 and Senate Bill 277, these basically follow Governor Hogan's proposal, putting $125 million from Maryland into a fund at Metro just for capital maintenance. And then House Bill 370 and Senate Bill 279, these are more on the governance side of the House. These bills would actually put the Maryland DOT secretary or the secretary's designee directly onto the WMATA Board of Directors. Theory there is that since MDOT is the one paying, if you have MDOT more directly involved in the operations and board management, you're sort of eliminating a middleman in that regard. So that's that. I will take questions now. And how we're going to work this? Is there any? I think there's a microphone. I think they're going to take it around to people, but.
You're first.
Hi, yeah, I'm John Compton from Washington Grove, the Historic Preservation Commission. Two things. First of all, the initial plan had the red line running right through to Virginia. Instead, it makes this crazy U-shaped, incredibly long route, which has turned out in recent years to pose problems for the transportation society. Nothing wrong with Metro, but it omits a huge gap. So that leads really to the question I have, is why has there been an inability to forward plan the Metro system beyond its original conception, with the exception of the Silver Line? I'll accept that. The region has not stopped growing. Fill-in has continued to increase in density, and yet there's been no planning that really wasn't done 30 years or 50 years ago. I mean, I'll leave it at that.
Okay. I'd say it's kind of twofold. One is that the system, ultimately what the region decided to build was a 103-mile system. There have been two extensions. So Maryland did extend the blue line from Addison Road to Largo, basically to get the blue line, like all other lines, to basically get to or just beyond the Beltway. Silver Line, as you mentioned, is the one extension. And again, Silver Line was on sort of the maps. I mean, they were envisioning rail to Dulles back in the 60s. But it's a challenge of funding. The region funded the 103-mile system. Any additions to that system are funded directly by the host jurisdiction. So, for instance, Maryland DOT funded the Blue Line extension to Largo. The Metropolitan Washington Airport Authority is basically funding, managing the Silver Line extension, and then those additions to Metro get turned over to Metro to operate. So at some level, it's not even Metro's ability to continue building new parts of the system. I would say from a different standpoint, there's only so far you can go, because ultimately these trains filling up in the suburbs, the trains will be kind of too full by the time they get closer in, and then the people closer in won't have any space to get on a train. So there is some limit as to how far you can keep extending the system. I'm not saying we're there yet, but that's another, part of the dynamics. Whoever grabs the mic.
Hi. What conclusions should we draw by your failure to discuss Silver Spring, the integration of sister transportation systems such as MARC and the upcoming Purple Line?
Well, I wouldn't draw any conclusions from that, but I mean, if you're looking for mobility within the region, definitely many different modes help integrate with Metro. So, for instance, I didn't talk about Purple Line either, but Purple Line will be obviously a major benefit to Montgomery County and Prince George's County, with links to 4 different Metro stations, Silver Spring, of course, included. And then, of course, the MARC system is a great system for feeding into Metro, and also for transfers between Metro and MARC system. And we see that at Rockville, we see that at Silver Spring. We see that at Union Station. Interestingly, Union Station is Metro's busiest station, and half the riders, even though it's in the district, half the riders using the Union Station station are Marylanders. So there's definitely a lot of interaction between MARC, VRE on the Virginia side, and other modes. I didn't mention ride-on, but Montgomery County funds an extensive bus network. So that whole network is basically serving neighborhoods, bringing riders. Usually, most ride-on lines basically end or begin at a metro station. So it's a whole integrated network. So definitely, it's all part of a transit network.
I have long thought that on this end of the red line, that it ends about 3 or 4 miles short of where it should have. Could you talk a bit about that, please?
Sure. Some of the initial concepts, and actually, one thing I did not mention, but when Matt invited me to speak, my first reaction was, well, you should get Zachary Schrag, because Zachary Schrag literally wrote the book. So the book is the Great Society Subway, and that book is actually for sale in the hallway. Just a plug for but anyway, so if you pick up that book, you'll see that some of the initial concepts actually had Metro stopping at Rockville initially, and then had future extensions to Gaithersburg and Germantown. So the initial concepts envisioned it getting out as far as Germantown. Again, we ended up at Shaded Grove because Rockville didn't want a rail yard, and again, it's just something that I'm not saying it's impossible, but right now it's not envisioned. So there are many other ways of getting more people to the end of the line. Another concept is the Quarter Cities Transitway, which would help from Clarksburg to Germantown to get folks to Shady Grove Metro. So there are other modes that can be utilized. But again, right now, there's nothing on the books for extending the red line.
I was wondering what happens to the old rail cars? Do they get like coral reefs or something?
So we have a contract actually with a vendor who recycles those rail cars. If you this past summer, actually, if you went to the Grosvenor station, one of those rail cars actually got cut up and by an artist, by a metal artist, and actually converted into small pop-up retail shops at the Grosvenor station. So that's one of the more unique applications, but most of them just get, we put a contract out to get them recycled. So that's what's happening with them.
I'd like to make a pitch for pop-up museum space at each one of the metro stations. Yes, ma'am. Can you please stand up when you...
Yes. Through the years, Metro funding has been, you want me to stand up? Okay. Through the years, Metro funding has been an annual issue, and you're talking about a multi-year trust fund, which certainly would help. The jurisdictions fight over who should pay for what. Mm-hmm. Clearly, this area is still growing, and the question really is can you comment on the prospects for us finally getting some rationality into this system, given some of the political machinations that we observe?
Good question. So I will say that Metro, it is a complex beast because the dynamics of having Virginia, Maryland, and DC all influencing how we manage the system just creates a more complex. Most other transit systems are much more, when they are multi-jurisdictional, you still usually have like the core city as the primary with some suburban influence. Metro is really equally managed by the three. So the dedicated funding that I talked about would be a benefit. It would help us with kind of the long-term capital planning. It would provide bondable funding so we could smooth out, so we could issue bonds and have those bonds guaranteed with that stream of revenues on the capital side of the budget. On the operating side, I don't think there's an easy answer. I think we're going to continue having the issues between, how much should we be charging the riders? How much should we be asking the governments to help subsidize? I mean, public transportation is by inherently publicly subsidized. The question is, at what level should that subsidy be? And there's no easy answer on that. But so maybe my answer is that at least some of that I think is going to continue. It's just kind of the nature of the system on the operating side.
A chicken and the egg question. The red line owes a lot to the availability of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad right-of-way. So which came first, knowing that you had that right-of-way available, or designing the red line in that U-shape and then realizing, we can put this on the B&O right-of-way?
Good question. I don't know exactly, but I know that one of the early designs for the red line actually continued from Silver Spring along the right-of-way to Rockville. So it was later that it took the other bend instead, and as you come out, and then it had the the getting from Connecticut, red line goes up Connecticut, then bends over underground and goes up Wisconsin. So those were all sort of done. I mean, it wasn't the initial concept. I'll say it that way. I don't know when they decided to have the red line instead bend more north rather than continuing from Silver Spring towards Rockville. But I think it was kind of a looking at the developments pattern and looking at what was buildable. And a lot of these also were influenced by the WMATA board. So the board, some of the early decisions back in the 67, 68, 69 timeframe, the WMATA board was to actually decide where should the stations be. One of the criticisms on the Fairfax County side, was that they didn't really look at the future plans. And it took a long time for them to actually build, rail through Tysons, even though they knew back in the 60s that Tysons was planned as a major development area. So some of the initial Fairfax County stations were built and designed for where they had existing population, even though those areas weren't necessarily where the county was focused on future population growth.
Hi.
So-
About a year ago, we heard a talk given by Paul Wiedefeld, and he mentioned that in the original plans for Metro, it was envisioned as a commuter system, that it wasn't envisioned as extending later into the day. And clearly that's changed a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And now with some of the safety initiatives, there have been cutbacks to the service, which have had a huge impact on service employees and other people who have late hours. So can you talk about where that is headed in terms of what the vision is for how Metro will serve people in the area?
Sure. So right now, we have cut back the hours. Or the other way is we've expanded the hours that were not open. So we're using those expanded hours of not being open for a preventive maintenance program. We're actually going in, testing, doing measuring, doing all sorts of analytics on the state of good repair of the system itself. So the board has told Paul Wiedefeld, you can do this for 2 years. And at a halfway point, so later this year, report back to us and let us know how this preventive maintenance program is working, and before the end of 2 years, report back whether you still need that additional window overnight to continue with the program, or have you progressed far enough that you can give back some hours to the region for more transit service. So I don't know exactly where we're going to wind up with that, but the board did not make it a blanket authorization forever that we're going to not stay open late on the weekends, or so it's a window of time that we have to basically improve our preventive maintenance, and hopefully we will be able to get that window back down some and give some hours back to the riding public.
So this is a positive note that I wanted to share with you. Metro's been a part of my life my entire life. And I have to say that I am so appreciative of the work that's been going into Metro in the past couple of years with the safe tracking, and I actually feel significantly more comfortable riding Metro now as a part of my day-to-day life than I did maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And knowing about that initiative that you have, seeing the new trains that are coming into service. I live by the Vienna Metro station, and seeing just the beautiful care that's being taken to restore that system and to bring it into the next phase is really appreciated, not only by myself, but I know many of the people in my community have just been really impressed with what's been happening. So between Vienna, Dunloring, and Tyson's, where I am, it's really changed people's lives, that things have become more consistent and the quality is increasing. So I just wanted to take a moment to thank you for that, because you hear so many not good things on the radio and in questions sometimes, but there is that positive momentum, and I just wanted to thank you.
Well, thank you. And I didn't know that I would have Virginians in the room too, but so we have legislation in Annapolis, but we also have legislation in Richmond also right now for dedicated funding. So please continue to encourage whoever your elected official is to support dedicated funding. Okay.
Stupid question, but this goes back to a friend of mine who protects the lives of the president. Can you name any president of the United States that's ever used Metro?
I don't know. I don't know whether Secret Service would allow that. But we've definitely spotted some members of Congress on the system before, but I don't know of a president.
The Washington metro area has the largest percentage of commuters using mass transit to get to work, but we also have the second longest commute times in the country. Can you address that contradiction?
Well, I don't know if we're actually at the largest. I think New York City has a larger percentage using transit, but we are at about 20% for this region. No, I think overall, people will call the metro system kind of a hybrid between a commuter rail and a subway. So in a lot of areas, up around New Jersey, New York area, you have to, take the rail, commuter rail to get to the subway, and then you take the subway to get to your office. Here, it's more of a, system where you get to the end of the line and then you can ride in. So it's a different system. I think it's just a more spread out region to some extent. And I think overall this region hasn't always done everything to invest in transportation, whether it be highways or transit. I think the region has so many great attributes, but investing in transportation, that hasn't necessarily been one of them.
There's a gentleman with a big stick. As soon as I saw that, I got over here as quick as I could.
This is really a historical question, not a what are you going to do about it question, but the committee that did the original design went all over Europe looking at subway metros there. Why didn't they look at Boston or New York? That's my question.
I think they were already more familiar with that. The other thing was that actually they also visited, I didn't mention it, but Toronto. And at the time, a lot of folks were saying, oh, we should have the next Toronto. And people were like, well, and Toronto was relatively new at the time. And I think the thought was, well, let's see what else is out there. But I think they were already familiar with the T and New York.
Good morning. I'm Dan Moore, I live at Grosvenor Park. I noticed that New York City is going through a major procurement for new cars, including cars where you can walk from one car to another. Do we coordinate major procurements with these other metro systems?
No, that's really not done in the transit world. Basically, every transit system has slight differences in how they either maintain the rail cars or other attributes that are unique to each system. Often it's the same vendors. I mean, right now we're buying our rail cars from Kawasaki, and Kawasaki just won a contract from New York for their rail cars. We had also, our maintenance garages, for instance, are a certain length, and we can fit basically 2 rail cars in that space. So we've looked at the concept of what they call sort of like your articulated bus, where it bends in the middle and a long bus. Hey, could we do that with a rail car and have, more space between rail cars and with a, bending articulated rail car? Right now, I don't think we're going to do that. I think the main challenge is that if we wanted a 4-car consist like that was articulated and not, that we don't really have rail facilities to put a 4-car length consist of rail cars for maintenance. So there would be added benefit. You would get more space for riders, to get on every train. Not a lot, but a few. But right now it would cost so much to retrofit and expand our rail yards that in the whole scheme of things, I don't think it's worth it.
Thank you. I'm Linda White. I live in Washington. Used to work in Montgomery County schools. I have a few questions. I thought it was interesting that the gentleman said that the planners went to Europe to look at the stations. But I've always wondered why the station in Washington and even New York, where I used to live, don't have walls between the people and the tracks. And I wonder if Metro ever gave thought to having walls like they do in some of the European cities. And another question is, signage in Metro is so bad, and especially if I'm at a place like Silver Spring, it would be nice to have something that says north or south. And I realize that the red line circles around, but it's kind of confusing. But even on most of the other, in most of the other stations, it's hard to see where you are when you're in the train. And the other thing is, the stations are dark. The underground stations that are in the city, they're dark, just inviting crime. And question about the muffled announcements. I don't know if there's a way to, everybody knows about that, right? Okay, we can't understand them. And then elevators. For the most part in New York, they have an elevator by each entry to a station. But in Washington, just as an example, Shaw Howard University, if you're at 8th and R, but need an elevator, you have to go all the way over to 7th Street. And people don't know that until they get there. So if somebody's maybe handicapped or disabled, how do they walk 2 blocks to get to an elevator? So I don't think these things are insurmountable. These are big things, but
Right.
maybe they can be planned.
I don't know which ones to tackle, but definitely, I mean, we've heard from on lighting. Some of these are part of the initial design of Metro. The dim part of Metro was supposed to be calm and soothing. Right. Now as people want more light for anti-crime, for low vision population. For many people want more light, and we are adding a light. It's not, we can't do it overnight, but we're trying to add more lighting into the system. For having a wall or some sort of barricade, as along the tracks, but that's been studied. Part of the challenge now is that not all the doors open at the same spot on the old trains versus the new trains, so there's no easy way to accomplish that. Elevators, I mean, the system when it was built, it was, before Americans with Disabilities Act, and it was kind of recognized early on that it actually was much more advanced than other American systems for accessibility. But we could do better. And obviously newer stations, when they're designed, now we're adding redundant elevators to systems, to stations. So we are trying to get better.
I had a question about the bus system
Yes.
that Metro runs. Have you tracked the historic bus lines and the transit companies that operated in the city of Washington and out through to the suburbs and paralleled the routes with that? And how is that moving forward in terms of bus ridership, which I hear is up in DC in particular?
So we started operating buses before rail. So in 1973, we basically bought 3 bus companies that were sort of going bankrupt. We bought it, and then a 4th one, and we basically inherited the lines. So the lines we're running today, many of them look remarkably similar to the lines that we were running back in the 1970s. We work with folks like Gary Ehrenrich to look at, all right, just because this route has been here for 40 years doesn't mean this is where people are trying to begin and end their bus ride today. So how can we change these routes to be more efficient, more serving today's population. It's challenging, let me tell you. Whenever you want to change a bus route, there's someone using that bus route exactly as it is today that doesn't want change. So that makes it challenging. But we are trying to figure out how can we improve, how can we take out some of the stops so that the bus isn't stopping every single block, but it's not easy.
So I hope you'll accept another couple of compliments.
Yes.
The first is to the city of Rockville for having the wisdom of not putting the end of the line right in the middle of the county seat. It's made a big difference in Rockville. But the other is to WMATA for, in the late 70s and early 80s, listening to preservationists in Rockville who were saying, don't destroy the B&O station, for which you had something like $30,000 in the budget to demolish, but instead moving it 30 feet south, 30 feet west, and turning it around to, and then selling it to a good body who's still taking care of it. So thank you from preservationists. But if you look, you were talking about design. Metro was flexible enough to listen again to preservationists in Rockville, who said everything else is curved. Rockville's B&O station traditionally had the peaked roof. So if you look at the Rockville station's roof, it is a peaked roof rather than a curved one. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
About 4 or 5 years ago, I was reading in the Washington Post about how Metro Board was told that single tracking on weekends was necessary for a few more years. I don't know recall exactly when it was supposed to end, but that time has definitely passed. And since I read that article, it's come out that there are all sorts of things wrong with the system, that it gone into a deep decline, that there are all sorts of safety issues. How was it that the management of Metro at that time was so unaware of all these problems?
Let's see. Okay, well, I mean, today I would say the concept of single tracking on the weekends, I don't see an end to that. If there was a suggestion that that was a temporary fix, definitely it should not have been put out there. So I don't know exactly what era of Metro that was. You said 4 or 5 years ago. No, I mean, as a system, I mean, as problems have cropped up and as we've done deeper dives into the state of the system, we do find more things that need to be replaced. People kind of basically call the system like a $40 billion asset, or the replacement cost would be $40 billion. And whenever you have an asset like that, you have to invest billions, at least billion, $1.5 billion a year, just to keep it going, the way it is, without any expansions, without any, real improvements. So no, we continue to test things. We just found a major electrical line, cable that was, original back over near Rhode Island Avenue that, wasn't, functioning like it should. And we had to go in there and, rip that out, or actually it's still underground. So we had to replace it. And then we still have a project coming up to actually go in and replace it. So we keep finding stuff. And I expect that we will continue to keep finding things that need to be fixed. I mean, the system keeps getting older. But because people want us running as late as we can to serve the nightlife of DC. I mean, it's always a competing, how much do we keep the system open to serve everyone who wants to use it, and how much do we keep the system closed to do the required maintenance? And it's trying to find that right balance.
I don't know how many historians might have been on the engineering group or the architectural group originally, probably none, but certainly when the board members went around, or the engineers and architects went around to look at European stations, they saw that there are quite a few that interpret the history of the station and bring in a much better visitor experience. Can you discuss whether there are any considerations being given to upgrading kind of the visitor experience, both from interpretation of sites at or near the stations, and also to improving the public address system, which even English speakers can't understand? I really feel sorry for foreign speakers.
So definitely the PA system on the rail cars, on the new 7000 series rail cars, is much better. We've done some improvements in the stations, but they're still not that much better. I think just the acoustics of that area is very, very challenging for us. It's not something that, that we haven't heard before. But so I don't know what our next phase of trying to improve internal acoustics are. The concept of how much information is available to the customer inside the station. Actually, some of the initial plans did not even want like the station name along the wall or the station name on the pylon in the station. That was a challenge convincing some of the early designers of the system that we have to give this to the customer to let them know what station they're at. So, but it was seen as being, and then also, of course, no advertising was ever envisioned within the system. They wanted very clean, as uniform as possible throughout the whole system. But we have done some things to try to improve some customer information. I was, volunteering in the system at Pentagon, and there we have, a touch screen. So it's an advertisement sometimes, but then if you touch it, it becomes the Metro system map with some information. So we're looking at how can we provide more customer information about the area and other things. Where's the bus? Where are the bus bays for the local bus routes? Different information like that. So we're getting there, but.
We've got time for two questions, one over there and one over here.
Have you rethought the lack of artwork in the metro system? I mean, I go to Paris or to London or Moscow, and I know each station is different. And I think it would increase local pride, and it would be something you could use to raise money from local business to have some artwork. And there is some nice artwork. If you come out of archives, for instance, there's a wonderful mural, but there's nothing in the station. And all those poor people who are half asleep on the subway don't know where they're getting off, and they might really enjoy seeing some artwork that would tell them.
So we do have an art in transit program. In fact, Laurent Aud, who's the manager of that, actually gave me some of the images that you all saw earlier. But so we do have some art in downtown stations within the station environment, but you just want to see more, I think. So. But it's a program. We have a program where we have sponsoring entities that try to add art. Right now, all brand new Silver Line stations include some sort of art. Often it's like in the plaza area, not necessarily right on the station platform. But there is a program for that, and we definitely, right now we're working with the city of Rockville, for instance, the underpass of the Metro tracks and also the CSX tracks, kind of that, iron rusting underpass, area. We're trying to see what can we do to add art to that, to make that part of so it won't be in the station, but it'll be there for the whole community to see and benefit from. So we are working on it.
I had always heard that Harry Weiss, the original designer, had maintained strict control over all design elements of the station, including lighting, signage, advertising, everything. And that didn't end until his death. Is that an urban myth, or is that actually true, that his firm maintained those restrictions?
I would say maybe partly both. It was basically the WMATA board was the one that had to approve additional advertising in the system. And for the longest time, they were resistant. Because some of the concepts of having this very clean, the brutalist, clean, simple aesthetic of the system was what we envisioned, and some others too. So I think his influence lasted a long time. I don't know whether he had to die before it could change, but I think it was more that the WMATA board had to evolve and had to recognize some of the financial constraints and the need to, encourage some advertising in the system while trying to keep it still tasteful and recognizing and trying to keep many of the aesthetics still there.
All right. Can we give Charlie a big round of applause?